Who's the MVP? Was Matt LaFleur ever a serious candidate for Coach of the Year? And how many Packers really deserve to make an all-NFL team? What's the state of the blue chippers on this roster? America's guest, Jason Hirschhorn, joins us on today's show.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the #1 Packers podcast on the internet. And the show for fans who know what happened, they want to know why and how. Thanks to everyone who makes Locked On Packers their first listen every day. We hope you like starting your day with us as much as we like starting our day with you. Jason Hirschhorn on today's show. It is our annual awards ballot episode. We'll go through MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, talk about Packers. Who are the best players on this team? Did any of them deserve to be on our all-NFL ballots? And are there rookies who made the all-rookie team? That's all coming up in just a second. I did want to mention, before we jump in here, we just got the reporting last night that Jeff Hafley was requested with the New York Jets. At this moment, that's all we know. He could decline. He could just say, you know what? I appreciate it. Not interested. I don't think he would be considered the front runner for that job. Certainly at this moment. Right now, from the things that I have heard and the things that I've read and seen reported, it seems like Aaron Glenn is the most likely candidate in New York for that job. But we'll see. This is not going to be the last time someone has interest in Jeff Hafley, to be sure. This is something we will talk about surely much more. We had a lot to talk about with Jason, so let's get to that. Joining me now, part of a couple annual traditions that we have here on Locked On Packers, The Leap's Jason Hirschhorn, a newsletter we would love for you to subscribe to. Also America's guest. He joins me now to go through our PFWA, Pro Football Writers, ballots for all NFL. We actually are casting these. These are not theoretical, hypothetical, whatever. Like, no, in fact, I clicked send about 2 hours before we're recording this. So like, this is official stuff here. And part of the reason why we want to do this, Jason, is to get a sense of the Packers roster. That was a big point of discussion as we got into the Eagles game as well. I'll stop monologuing. And let's start with the most important award that we give out every year, the MVP. Who was your MVP this year?
I went with Josh Allen, and this was one of the more difficult MVP votes I've had to cast. The argument for Lamar Jackson doesn't really have a hole in it, right? Like, he was objectively better than the previous season when he won the MVP. But I felt ultimately that Josh Allen had done more, both in a vacuum and considering the context of his team. Like, Josh Allen is not just the engine that makes the Bills offense go. He might be, if we removed him, the only thing that makes that offense go. Whereas Lamar Jackson, removing him obviously would have a significant impact on the Ravens, but I think schematically they have some advantages that the Bills don't have. I think they have more overall skill talent in offense than the Bills have. And I just think that it was worthwhile to recognize Josh Allen in that way, because he does more, I think, or has done more this season than anybody else at that position, and maybe period.
I wish we could argue about this. I frankly thought Josh Allen should have won last year. And I think Dak Prescott had the award until Christmas. He fell apart at the end of the season. Lamar Jackson stole it with the 49ers beating the 49ers. So I think coming out of the last two seasons with them each getting one is the right outcome. Even if, again, to your point, Lamar Jackson was better this year, like unmistakably better this year than he was last year. I do the thing that I think is allowed, and I treat Offensive Player of the Year as its own award. Am I correct in remembering that you think that's stupid?
I think it's objectively stupid, yes. So because Josh Allen was my MVP and because he plays on offense, he was my Offensive Player of the Year. Had that been Lamar Jackson, it would have been the same deal there. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around the idea that the person who won the MVP is somehow not the best player on their side of the ball. So
I know
in every year that I've cast this vote, my MVP has also won that side's Player of the Year award.
I think the last time you and I had this discussion, because I think last year, maybe it wasn't, but maybe it was 2 years ago when Cooper Kupp was so incredible. Was that 2000? I guess that was 2021 when he won the Triple Crown. I did not. I voted for Aaron Rodgers for MVP and voted for Cooper Kupp for Offensive Player of the Year because I wanted to recognize that season. We don't recognize receivers, running backs, other positions in MVP, and so I like to do that. It's just my little, vote against the man in some ways. I found this to be the hardest Defensive Player of the Year candidacy that I can remember since we've been doing this.
Yeah, certainly since you and I have had votes. And for much of the season, I don't think that this is a wrong way of doing it. I was viewing it like who's the most impactful front seven player, because generally speaking, that is the player who not only will win the award, but is going to actually have the most impact. But that's not the way I voted this year. I'm curious. Did you have a front seven player as your Defensive Player of the Year?
I did.
Okay. Who was it?
I went with Myles Garrett because he was second in the league in pressures, got double teamed at a rate as high as any player in the NFL. And I wanted to recognize him for continuing to give a damn as the world crumbled around the Cleveland Browns. He continued to play his butt off, play hard every single time out. And I just think he's the best defensive player in the league. And absent another, ultra elite season from someone else, I felt like that was the most deserving. Did you go like Pat Surtain here? Did you go Kirby Joseph here? Like, I'm curious to know now.
So I will say, until I think it was the last 2-3 weeks of the season, I don't know exactly when I switched it for myself, it was Myles Garrett for me too. And I recognize all those arguments. He was phenomenal. And that would have been true in a season where the Browns were competitive, let alone one where they clearly weren't. I did go Patrick Surtain. I felt ultimately like it was one of those special seasons, not just for a defensive player, but like from a defensive back. Like we have seen this in the past on rare occasions when a defensive back is so impactful, not just in the ways, let's say, a cornerback can be, but essentially being all over the defense, making his impact felt, that it's at least worthy of consideration. I felt like this year, when we didn't have one of those incredible overall pass rushing seasons, even if Myles Garrett was still phenomenal among others, I thought it was the right time. And I felt that Patrick Surtain was that rare defensive back who merited the award. So that is who I voted for.
We're gonna get into the running backs in a second, but I just want to tell you, the player that I voted for Offensive Player of the Year is Saquon Barkley. I just felt like the 2,000 yards, the lift that he gave that team, he was the engine of the second best team, like they weren't the second best offense, but they were the second best team in the NFC. And that was only because of Saquon Barkley on the offensive side. They became a run heavy team. And I wanted to recognize him for that. I do want to get into that running back part of the discussion. So let's get there in a second. Coach of the Year. Who is your Coach of the Year?
I went with Andy Reid. And I feel like this is one of those awards that, and by we, I don't mean you and me, I mean like the collective voters, will almost always give to the coach that surprised us the most. And it is clearly how this award gets stripped up, right? Like, it was only a few years ago that Brian Daboll like blew away expectations and won the award. And in the moment I told you on this very show that it should have been Kyle Shanahan that year, and that we're just not giving him the recognition because we expect him to be great, whereas nobody had any expectations for those Giants. And I think to a certain degree, we're doing a version of that here. Like, we just expect the Chiefs to be awesome. And they were, again, by record, really awesome. And they just, they didn't have the offense that they usually do, even relative to last year. They had injuries, like, Mahomes was hurt. We can debate how serious that injury was, but he still was injured. The injuries at running back, the receiving core was changing throughout the year, and they just kept winning. And at a certain point, why would you ignore the coach that is making that possible? Because it's clearly Andy Reid that has built the infrastructure along with Patrick Mahomes that makes the Chiefs a perennial winner. So that's who I went with. I think that we need to consider arguments like this more often, because otherwise we're just going to go with a choice that a year, 2 years later is going to look silly.
I think you're right about all of that, except this year. And I think there were other years that Andy Reid deserved it and did not get it. This year, though, the Chiefs, their win-loss record seems so fake to me, and all the close games and all that stuff. It just, I could, and I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth here because I voted for Kevin O'Connell, but not just because they won 14 games, but because he gets credit for Brian Flores and bringing him in and the work
Mhm.
that they did. He gets credit for the best season of Sam Darnold's career by like a factor of 4. And I understand that they flamed out, and maybe by the way, we should vote on these awards after the season. But I was so impressed again that they seem to maximize everything that they have on their team consistently. And I am surprised, frankly, that this is where we landed, because I thought for a stretch, like for 3 games, I was like, it should be Matt LaFleur. Malik Willis, winning games with Malik Willis. And then I was like, well, I think this Viking thinks is fake, so maybe it should be Dan Campbell. And so I was all over the place on this. I understand what you're saying about Andy Reid. I just don't know if this is the right year for that.
I think that's a fair point. And with Kevin O'Connell in particular, like, this isn't like Kevin O'Connell popped up and suddenly they were good. Like that first Vikings season with Kevin O'Connell, I had skepticism, because why wouldn't you, right? Like all their underlying metrics suggested that they weren't a team worth double-digit wins, and they got it anyway. So I definitely approached that Vikings team with skepticism. That's different this year. We've now seen him do a version of this multiple times. Even the one season where they had the lesser record, they actually were on the margins a better team than they were the year that they won all those games. So, if you had skepticism of Kevin O'Connell going into this year, which I think would have been fair, I think you have to reconsider that now. So Kevin O'Connell was absolutely up for this award in my mind. I just felt like at a certain point, am I going to ignore Andy Reid doing the thing again? Yeah, like this is not the best version of the Chiefs. If they win the Super Bowl this year, it'll be the weakest of the Chiefs Super Bowl winners. But the fact that we're having that conversation is sort of the point, right? Like Andy Reid has him here again, and he's doing it with even like less resources on the margins than he's ever had during this run. So that's what pushed it for me. But I do get the Kevin O'Connell argument. I get the Dan Campbell argument, even though neither of us voted for him. I think at the end of it, like those were the 3 names that I felt you could make the strongest arguments for.
Look, this is part of the reason why I think that there is some merit in voting after the season, because if they do win the Super Bowl again, I will be with you. I will be saying, look, this is the worst version of the Chiefs, and they won the Super Bowl anyway. And that's really for 2 reasons: Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, and we should recognize that. I want to dig into the player stuff because I want to talk about Packers. I do have some Packers on my all NFL and all rookie lists. We'll get to those a little bit in a second. What about Packers on the all NFL team? That's what we call it. The PFWA is all NFL. We'll talk about it next on Locked On Packers. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. One thing you can do is when you see a team in the first round and they look really good, there is a good chance that they are going to be overvalued in round 2 when it seems like, oh, they played a little too well. That's the Rams for me. The Eagles 6.5-point favorites now in Philly. That line did not open there. It has gotten there. I expect it to go up. I would want to bet it now, especially before you get to that 7-point spot. So go to FanDuel.com to join today and get $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. But let's start with the all NFL lists. We talked about quarterback. Presumably we both have Josh Allen there. I have Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley at running back. Do you have anything different?
Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. And I don't know how you ordered them. I know it doesn't really matter. Like you put 1 or 2, the vote is worth the same. But I felt like Barkley had the best season of any of these running backs. And Derrick Henry had, in a certain sense, the most impressive season given the full context. Like running backs at his age should not be doing this. Like Barkley is still in his physical prime. And, we saw that throughout the season. Yeah. Derrick Henry, by running back standards, should have been like near retirement at this point. And he had maybe the best season of his career, or at least in that conversation. So both those guys were phenomenal. They were my all NFL votes.
If you had, and we don't do at PFWA, we don't do second team, but if you had second team votes, would Josh Jacobs have been on your list? Because he would have been on mine. I think he was probably my 3rd running back.
He was. And so the way the PFWA breaks it up is they do all NFL, which is like essentially the equivalent of the all pro, and they do all AFC and all NFC. Yeah. So it's a little different. I kind of prefer the way in a vacuum that the AP does it, but I actually like that they're different because we can sort of, in the collective, represent more of the league. And yeah, for one of those all NFC running back spots, the one that wasn't taken by Barkley, I gave it to Josh Jacobs. I actually didn't pick another AFC running back. I just think any of the other guys besides Derrick Henry were deserving of that honor.
Yeah, I've certainly done that in the past. I don't have that ballot in front of me, but I can't think of one off the top of my head that I'd be like, yeah, that guy definitely deserving. At the receiver position, I had Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. This great stat from Sports Info and Solutions: Justin Jefferson had 28 plays of 20 yards or more this year. The next closest guy had 7. Justin Jefferson is just the best receiver in the NFL. It stinks for the Packers that they have to play this guy every year twice. And they're going to have to play him every year twice for the next probably decade plus.
Yeah, same choices for me. I don't think there was really much of a debate there. And it was a good year for receivers. Like it wasn't like those were the only 2 guys that you would say had an all pro or all NFL caliber season, but they were the 2 clear best. I don't think there was reasonable debate about that.
Okay, so let's go to tight end. I had Brock Bowers, and I actually want to frame the question this way: how many all NFL teams do you think you would have needed to include Tucker Kraft?
We've had to go further on the list. I did not go Bowers for the all NFL team. I went with George Kittle.
Yeah,
but
that would have been my second.
Yeah, but Bowers was my choice for all AFC. Coming out of the box that way at that position is obviously extremely impressive. I think he did benefit from the fact that there was basically nobody else on that offense after Devontae Adams was traded for you to throw to, right? Like at a certain point, are you going to throw to Bowers or are you going to throw an incomplete pass? Like those were the choices given to the Raiders quarterbacks. Now, Bowers still did.
Damn it, they threw a lot of incomplete passes.
They did. That is true. However, I felt like ultimately what George Kittle did, not just as a pass catcher, but especially in other parts of that offense as a blocker in the run game, downfield, like he remains, even if he's not, all caps George Kittle the way he was, 3-4 years ago, he's still the best tight end in the league. And, maybe that changes next year. Obviously, Bowers has a great chance to become that guy moving forward. But right now, that is still Kittle for me.
Yeah, Kittle would have been second. He was my all NFC selection. I believe he was Pro Football Focus's #1 graded tight end this season. Did not get the volume that some of those other guys had, like Trey McBride and Brock Bowers each went over 100 catches. Like that's crazy stuff to do. Or 100 targets, maybe it is. But it is interesting how the position is evolving. I think this is as deep as the tight end position has been in a long time because we still have the old guard, the Kittle, the legacy guys, Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, and then we have this new group that I do think includes Tucker Kraft. Although I probably would have had to go like 4th team All NFC to get to Tucker Kraft. I was kind of being facetious on that one. Offensive line, an
unrealistic conversation, by the way, in the future. Like Tucker Kraft, by the end of his rookie year, already looked like a plus starter tight end, which for a rookie is incredible. Like you're happy with that result. By the end of this year, you could have actually made the argument he was the most dangerous pass catcher on Green Bay, or at least he's in that conversation. Going to year 3, health permitting, there could be another big jump for him. And then maybe we're having a very different conversation about the Packers offense at this time next year. But, we'll get to that point.
Yeah, and Matt LaFleur mentioned that they would like to feature him more. They think that they can. They think that they should. There were a number of times, I thought on Sunday, where there was an opportunity to get the ball to Tucker Kraft, and he just wasn't the main read on the route. It's not about Jordan not finding him or those kinds of things. Let's go to tackle here, the offensive line, because there may be an opportunity to talk about some Green Bay Packers in here. I had Tristan Wirfs and Lane Johnson as my 2 offensive tackles. Who did you have?
So for tackles, I actually didn't have either of those. I had Penei Sewell for all NFL. I had Penei Sewell and Rashawn Slater. I get both those choices. I actually kind of expected us to have a debate over Lane Johnson versus Zach Tom. Those were my considerations for all NFC. Ultimately went with Sewell, obviously made the all NFL team, so he's going to be in my all NFC, and went with Lane Johnson. Zach Tom was not far off. And I know, especially in the world of Packers Twitter, people like to debate how many sacks Lane Johnson has actually allowed this year. But put that game aside, Lane Johnson, at least by Pro Football Focus's charting, had, including the playoffs so far, 10 total pressures. What else do you need to say? And he's obviously still great in the run game. Like he is, despite being in the league for 1,000 years, is still one of the premier players at any offensive line position. And I didn't think that Zach Tom was actually that much of a step down, but that difference still mattered. And, especially when we're talking about the running game for the Eagles being really the head, the spear of that offense, the head of the spear. Well, to a certain point, you also have to give credit to the offensive line, right? Like, it's
Absolutely.
not just Saquon Barkley getting all of those yards. It's all of the yards he got before contact, too. Lane Johnson, the biggest individual component of that. I understand it's a great offensive line. It's not just one player, but Lane Johnson is the best of those players, and I thought it was worthy of recognition.
Zach Tom, second graded offensive tackle this season, including the playoffs. Second. So ahead of Lane Johnson, ahead of Tristan Wirfs, ahead of Rashawn Slater. I do think that's worth saying. I just think having watched Zach Tom pretty closely this season, that's one of those weird ones where, like, I kind of don't agree. Like, I feel like he's probably the third best right tackle in the league right now. But at the same time, I think that there's like 6 or 8 tackles that I think are just flat out better than him. So I think he can get there. The first year where he is going in knowing I'm a preferred starter and I know I'm good, whereas last year he's going in as the preferred starter and he's a first time starter, right? So we should expect some growing pains there from him. And I couldn't even put him on my all NFC team because it's just like there's between Sewell and Johnson, I just felt like those guys were, at least to me, clearly better. And maybe I had the Eagles game too fresh in my mind. I mean, I can't rule that sort of recency bias out. Like I'm only human.
I suppose, yes. For what it's worth, I cast my ballot at the end of week 18 before the playoff games. But again, like Lane Johnson allowed 0 additional pressure since then. So it didn't really change how I felt about him.
Let's go to the defensive side because I do want to have an opportunity to actually talk about a Packer who belongs on the team. Let's sort of start in reverse order. We talked about Myles Garrett and the defensive ends. I don't think we have any misgivings about putting Packers in those situations. But the safeties, I had Xavier McKinney and Kirby Joseph as someone who had a defensive back as his defensive player of the year. Where did you land with the safeties?
I went with Xavier McKinney for one of those spots and Kyle Hamilton for the other. And Kyle Hamilton.
You think Kirby Joseph's a dirty player too, Jason, is what you're saying?
ILL, Peter. I mean, it's right behind me. But if you consider what Kyle Hamilton was asked to do over the course of the season, like he is the most impactful player in the Ravens, like secondary. I mean, we knew that going into the year, but they expected to move him around. And for parts of the year they did, and the parts of the year were like, no, we just have too many injuries. You go back there and be the safety. And then he did that, and it solidified the entire unit. And if you look at the trajectory of that defense, we were, especially covering the Packers, talking about some of the defensive coaches they had considered for the defensive coordinator position. One of those guys was Zach Orr, the guy who got the job with the Ravens. It did not look great for the Ravens early on.
No.
And who solved that problem for Zach Orr and that team? It was Kyle Hamilton. So I think when you consider that even in a vacuum, like he was just a tremendously impactful player again. And that was through playing with some pretty significant injuries at one point. I felt like when you considered all of those factors, he was worthy of the all NFL vote. I get the vote for Kirby Joseph. He was on my all NFC list, but I just felt like Kyle Hamilton just did a little bit more than he did, though I think is absolutely worthy of debate.
I think also Kyle Hamilton's move solidified that defense because it allowed Marlon Humphrey to play in his more natural position. And that, I think, that put that defense. I mean, they were one of the worst passing defenses in the NFL through 6 weeks, and making that switch really, I think they finished as a top 10 defense overall. So it really had a meaningful impact. Whereas the Lions, like, because of the injuries, they never quite got to reach that same sort of ceiling. I think Kirby Joseph's season deserved recognition as well. Xavier McKinney is one of those interesting ones. Like I considered him, the PFWA has a most improved player. I think there's an obvious candidate there. I voted for Zach Bond. He was also my first team All-Pro linebacker, but I thought Xavier McKinney had a case to win that award too.
I get that argument, but I felt like he was coming in as a really good player and exited the season as an arguably great one.
Yeah.
Bond, I felt like the difference was greater than I didn't actually vote for either one of them for most improved, and we can get into that if you want. But I feel like the Bond argument is stronger because he was a tertiary piece at his previous stop.
He was a cast off. Like let's call it what it was.
Like I'm not saying it's 1-to-1 the same, but like it's not totally different than the way that Devondre Campbell went from being a cast
exactly
off
what I was thinking of
with the Cardinals and among other teams to being essentially like the heart of that Packers defense in 2021. Bond, I actually thought was probably a little better this year than Campbell was that year.
I do too.
But regardless, I feel like the argument for Bond there is very strong. Even if it's not who I voted for, I think I could be convinced of that given enough.
Who did you vote? We don't have to like spend a lot of time talking about it, but who did you vote for?
I voted for Sam Darnold.
Oh, I mean, that it seems like an obvious one. That was one of my first thoughts. And I think, again, because I voted on this after the playoffs, I think the Sam Darnold game against the Rams was probably a little too fresh in my mind. And Zach Bond's excellent performance against the Packers maybe a little too fresh in my mind on that one. And maybe my vote for Kevin O'Connell being a part of that, maybe going, hey, like Kevin O'Connell deserves some credit for that as well. All right. Because I don't know that there's a lot of other Packer related stuff to talk about here. I just want to know if you considered any other Packers at any spot, any Elton Jenkins, any, I frankly don't even know who else I would bring up.
No, I mean, Zach Tom was the only guy who didn't get a vote from me that was in consideration at one point for the all NFL or all NFC team. I mean, it was both a really good year for the Packers and also kind of like a quiet year individually for a lot of those players.
So what is the state of the Packers roster with these blue chippers? And what do they have with these rookies? Special. We'll talk about that next. Could Rocket Money help you find subscriptions you forgot about? Have you ever had that happen to you? I hate to admit it, but I have, where you forgot that you're paying for something or that you're paying for something twice. Rocket Money makes it easy to track all that down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps finding and canceling your unwanted subscriptions easy. They monitor your spending, they help lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. So let's move to the rookie team because I did have two Packers on that rookie team, Edgerrin Cooper and Evan Williams. Only two rookie defenders this year who played meaningful snaps, graded out over 80 in Pro Football Focus's grading system, Jared Verse and Edgerrin Cooper. And of the top 5 highest graded rookies at any position, offense or defense, Edgerrin Cooper was 4th, along with Jaden Daniels, Jared Verse, Malik Neighbors, and Brock Bowers. So 3-4 top 20 guys, and then a early second round pick. I don't know that you would have had too many. Like, I think if I'd have had a second team all NFC, I really think Edgerrin Cooper would have had to have my vote. Like, I think he was that impactful in the second half of the season.
The sample size wasn't big, obviously, because, he missed some time, and earlier in the season they were playing him, but not a lot. But Edgerrin Cooper down the stretch had such a compelling argument. And, he was, for me, obviously a vote for linebacker. We're allowed 3 of those. And frankly, I don't know that there were 3 really strong choices in total, but Cooper.
I felt strongly about 2. And then, I was like, okay, I guess I'll throw on the Seattle linebacker as well. I think was my third one.
Yeah. And Edgerrin Cooper, essentially in what amounted to, let's say, 2/3 to 3/4 of a season snap wise, was just that impactful. Like, down the stretch, you could have made the argument, and I think we both have, that he was their best defensive player. Like, in the month of December to present, was probably their best defensive player, full stop, independent of context. And if that is the case, you're probably the best rookie at your position.
He led rookies in tackles for loss. Like, he had more tackles for loss than Jared Verse, who is going to be, again, who's going to win Rookie of the Year, Defensive Rookie of the Year. So, like, I think that tells you about how impactful he can be. The other one for me, Evan Williams, the safety. He and Coop both ended up not playing as many snaps as you would like, given, like, trying to get these awards, but I also ultimately did not feel like there was anyone else that deserving. Evan Williams was also one of the highest graded, I think one of the top 20 highest graded rookies from Pro Football Focus in this class. And he's just like a steady guy. He's kind of like the new Adrian Amos, where it's just like, you're going to expect him to do the right things most plays and be happy about it.
Yeah. You got to vote for me too. I felt like it wasn't a great overall year for safeties, which also to a certain degree included Javon Bullard, who wasn't strictly a safety, but he was at times. They moved him around, all of that stuff. But Evan Williams, who didn't get a lot of playing time early on, we wrote about this at the Leap, ended up becoming like a truly solidifying force for that Packers defense. Like not just the secondary, the defense. Like he allowed them to play Bullard in his more natural position. He solidified not just the passing game in that respect, but he also helped in the run. Like was just a solid player for a rookie.
Being able to play deep meant you could play Xavier McKinney up if you wanted to based on matchups, or you could flip it based on matchups.
Yeah, so he was solid as a rookie, which is already a win at that position. He was, I would say, not like a huge plus in the aggregate, but a plus defender at that position, which for a rookie, huge win. And they got him in the 4th round, which, for a pick that received a lot of criticism in the moment, I don't just mean from other parties. Like you and I had questions about it too. It's hard to argue with it now. Like he looks like one of the most important pieces of that defense moving forward. And he's 23? Like presumably his best football is ahead of him.
And I know Jim Nagy loves to hype up Senior Bowl guys, but he was adamant that he had heard from multiple teams, his wording, that they wanted to that they were going to take him to start day 3, that they were going to take him 4th round, 5th round. So he went right where Nagy said they were going to. I had Evan Williams on the show a couple weeks ago, I guess probably 2 or 3 months ago now. And he was like, yeah, I didn't think I was going to go as high as I did. Like the fact that the Packers picked him where they did was a shock even to Evan Williams. So I think that tells you the quality of that pick. I want to shift the discussion as we close this out to the state of the Packers roster, because this was a conversation going into the Eagles game. Like, what position group would you take the Packers over the Eagles? And you look around the NFC, and I think that's a reasonable conversation to start having. So I think top to bottom, this is a very deep roster. It is a very talented roster. But I do think the criticism of, hey, where is the high-end talent? It is looking more fair this year than it was last year when they just weren't expected to be the same level of team.
Yeah, I do think that criticism is fair. And let's just pinpoint one position for which this matters: receiver.
Yeah.
This time a year ago, the Packers had valid reasons for optimism about that group. And I'm not saying that all those reasons are gone. Like there's still reasons to think that group is going to be collectively very good moving forward. But you had Jaden Reed off a phenomenal rookie season. You had Dontavian Wicks.
A record-setting all-time Packers rookie season.
Yes. You had Dontavian Wicks, who didn't play a ton early, but as a rookie was really, really good. And probably by the end of their run, their best receiver in the 2023 season. You had Christian Watson, who had been battling injuries, but we know what he's capable of in terms of playmaking. You had Dobbs as being sort of that like safety net, security blanket type. And collectively was a very talented group. Even if none of those guys were the clear number one, you didn't feel bad about any of them. Now where we sit, Watson is obviously hurt in a significant way. Dobbs, not to the same degree, but there are health concerns with him now. He's had 2 concussions over the back half of this past season. Reed
also got suspended this year. We can't forget that part of it. As we
we'll call them non-on-field considerations, let's say. Reed, I felt like had a very strong season. I know that there was a lot of, let's just say, like fantasy football bros who were mad about the second half of the season. That's not totally on him, even if he does bear some responsibility for it. I felt like in total, it was a better season than he had as a rookie, but maybe not the jump up a lot of us were expecting, especially after that super hot start he had the 2024 season. And Wicks was sort of like the reverse, like just a terrible brutal first half of the season. And the back of the season was actually very strong, certainly relative to the first half, but didn't take that step that the Packers were certainly hoping for. You look at it and say, we still like these pieces, at least when they're healthy, but are any of these guys bucket getters, for lack of a better term? And that's how I wrote about it at the Leap. There are going to be situations where the egalitarian approach will not work, and you just need to go to someone who you know is not just likely to win, but extremely likely to win. You can't say that right now about any of these guys week in, week out for one reason or another. And I think that's where maybe like the Eagles comes in. Like that receiving room is obviously not nearly as deep. Like their number 3 receiver is what? Like John Dotson. Yeah. Huge step down. But there's not few guys.
He would even be on the Packers roster, frankly.
Yeah, it is certainly fair to argue that. But when you have A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith,
who cares?
You don't need that same degree of contribution from the other guys. And obviously, they also have like a very good tight end when he's healthy in Dallas Goedert, which the Packers have a version of too in Tucker Kraft. But the point being is, at a certain point, you do probably need someone to just win in those high leverage situations. I know we've talked about in the past how a lot of playoff games are determined by, let's say, a team's like number 3 receiver in terms of the production.
Yeah.
A lot of the reason that that player can have big production is because there's a receiver capable of just pulling the whole defense to them on every passing play. Like these things work in tandem. So I do think that the Packers need to seriously consider adding to that group. And I don't just mean in the draft, although I think that will be a part of it. I think they're going to have to seriously consider for the first time in a while making a meaningful addition from the veteran market. I just wrote for the Leap, but what that could mean, T. Higgins was mentioned, Devontae Adams is mentioned. We can get into those discussions if you want, but I don't think this is just going to be add one guy through one mechanism and then see what happens. I think it's probably going to be not an overhaul, but a larger bolstering of the position group because, even if things work out really well for Watson, even if things work out really well for Dobbs, those are both guys going to the final years of their deal. It may not be the case that either one of them are back, or maybe only one of them is back. All of that remains to be seen. So this is the time for the Packers to add to that group so that they can cover themselves in the short run and in the longer term.
Just to put a button on this, on 3rd and 8, what's the call?
For 2025?
Right. Like this season, if it's 3rd and 8, I didn't know where the ball was going. And I feel like if you're a team that wants to be serious, you have to have an answer for that. And even if you don't have just like the Lions don't have a one-on-one, like I'm just going to post you up on a slant route like Jamar Chase kind of player, but Amon-Ra St. Brown in the slot on an option route is like damn near uncoverable. So like that is a pretty nice thing to have. Do the Packers have anything close to that? I think right now the answer is no. And if you want to be a Super Bowl team, I think you need something like that. Even the Chiefs, who don't really have that kind of thing, on 3rd and 8, it's all right, Patrick, figure it out, find 87 at some point, run around until you can see him, and then throw him the ball. That works when you have 2 Hall of Famers in that spot, even if Travis Kelce's not at his prime. So I have come around on this too. I'm with you. I wish we could disagree on it, but we don't. I do want to have that receiver discussion. We will have that at some point down the line. Until then, we'll talk soon, man. I appreciate it.
Anytime, Peter.
All right. Thanks to Jason for joining the show. Awesome, as always, to talk to him. Go check out The Leap, a newsletter we would both love for you to subscribe to. More coming this week. I want to talk about this pass rush. I want to talk more about Jeff Hafley. A lot more to come this week. And then next week we will start. I said no draft this week. We are not going to talk at all about the draft. At all. Well, about the specifics of the players in this draft. Next week, I will have started the process of looking at these guys, researching these guys. And that'll be fun. I'm excited for that. It's one of my favorite parts of off-season, in-season, doesn't matter. One of my favorite parts of the year. So back tomorrow with a lot more. Follow us on the socials and the podcast on socials, me and the podcasts, both of us individually, and then subscribe, of course, wherever you find podcasts. You'll find Locked On Packers. We're on YouTube. We'll go live. A lot of fun stuff coming your way in the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, next couple of years. Who knows? We're always here so you can stay Locked On Packers.